At her grandfather's funeral, she was treated like a stranger. The next day, she inherited nothing but a failing antique shop. But hidden beneath that condemned building was a secret powerful enough to rewrite the story of 4 generations and expose one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching this video from. Rain fell against the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Cathedral that cold autumn morning. Inside, the Hartford family had gathered for Victor Hartford's funeral, though few seemed genuinely touched by grief. The mahogany casket, draped in white lilies, rested at the altar while the priest delivered words that most in attendance barely heard. Elena Hartford sat alone in the back row, as far from her family as the cathedral would allow. At 28, she had grown accustomed to this distance, this invisible wall that separated her from the people who shared her bloodline. In her hands, she clutched a small antique compass, its brass surface worn smooth by decades of handling. Her grandfather had given it to her when she was 12, telling her it would always point her toward what mattered most. In the front pew, her father Richard sat rigid and expressionless, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his grey hair impeccably styled. Beside him, his second wife Diana adjusted her designer hat and checked her watch with barely concealed impatience. Charles, Eleanor's older brother, whispered something to their father that made Richard nod with cold approval. Even from the back row, Elena could see the calculating gleam in their eyes. They weren't mourning. They were already dividing the spoils. The funeral was merely an inconvenient formality standing between them and the inheritance they believed was rightfully theirs. The rejection had begun 8 years earlier, when Elena's mother Margaret died in a car accident. Richard had blamed Elena for encouraging her mother's artistic pursuits, for supporting her passion for antiques and restoration work. He claimed that if Margaret had been focused on the family business instead of her hobbies, she would never have been driving to that estate sale in the storm. The accusation was irrational, cruel, and completely unfounded. But grief had twisted Richard's heart into something hard and unforgiving. What little love he had once felt for his daughter had calcified into cold resentment. Charles had taken their father's side immediately, as he always did. The golden child, the business prodigy, the son who had never disappointed anyone. He mocked Elena's decision to study art history instead of business, ridiculed her modest job as a museum docent, and made it clear at every family gathering that she was tolerated, not welcomed. When Diana entered the picture 2 years after Margaret's death, the exile became complete. Diana saw Elena as a reminder of the first wife, a ghost she wanted erased from the family portrait. Together, they had systematically excluded Elena from every family event, every holiday dinner, every moment that might have reminded them she existed. Victor Hartford had been the only one who still treated Elena like family. The eccentric founder of Hartford Antiques, Victor had built his fortune not through corporate ruthlessness like his son, but through a genuine love of history and beauty. Every Sunday for the past 8 years, Elena had visited her grandfather at his shop, spending hours learning about rare pieces, restoration techniques, and the stories behind forgotten treasures. Those visits were the only bright spots in her increasingly isolated life. Victor had taught her to see value where others saw nothing, to appreciate the stories objects carried, to understand that true worth wasn't measured in price tags. Now, Victor was gone, and Eleanor was truly alone. As the service ended, the family filed out first, not looking back. Elena waited until the cathedral was nearly empty before approaching the casket. She placed a single white rose beside the lilies, her hand trembling as she touched the smooth wood one final time. She wanted to speak, to say goodbye, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply closed her eyes and remembered all those Sunday afternoons, the patient lessons, the gentle wisdom, the unconditional love that had kept her afloat through 8 years of family rejection. A memory surfaced unbidden from 8 years ago, standing in the antique shop, surrounded by dusty treasures. 20-year-old Elena had watched her grandfather examine a Ming Dynasty vase, his hands moving with practiced grace as he turned the piece, studying every detail, every imperfection. He had looked up at her then, his eyes bright with knowledge, and something else, something she now recognized as foreknowledge. He had told her that true value wasn't always visible on the surface, that the most precious things were often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right eyes to see them. At the time, Elena thought he was just talking about antiques. Now, standing at his funeral, she wondered if he had been talking about something else entirely. As Elena turned to leave, Charles stepped into her path near the cathedral door, his expensive cologne mixed with the scent of incense and rain. He looked her up and down with unconcealed disdain, taking in her second-hand dress and worn shoes. His smirk said everything without words. The prodigal daughter, the disappointment, the one who didn't belong. He made a show of examining his watch as if her very presence was wasting his valuable time. Then he stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, gesturing for her to pass like she was a stranger he was being forced to tolerate. Richard approached from behind, and for a brief, foolish moment, Eleanor's heart leaped with hope. Perhaps grief had softened him. Perhaps this tragedy would bridge the gap between them. But his eyes remained cold as winter stone as he informed her about the will reading the next day at Mr. Abernathy's office. 2 o'clock. Don't be late. The words were delivered like a business appointment, not an invitation to grieve together. There was no warmth in his voice, no recognition of their shared loss, no acknowledgement that they were father and daughter. Just cold, hard practicality and barely concealed impatience to get through this unpleasant business. Elena tried to speak, to reach out, to somehow breach the wall between them. Her lips parted, her hand moved slightly forward, but the words died in her throat as she saw the absolute emptiness in her father's eyes. He looked through her, rather than at her, as if she were a transparent obstacle in his path. Then he walked past her, as if she were a stranger, his shoulder nearly brushing hers, but his gaze never making contact. Diana followed, making sure Eleanor heard her cutting remark about poor girls who couldn't even afford proper funeral attire. The words struck like physical blows, but Eleanor had learned not to flinch. She stood alone in the empty cathedral as rain continued to fall outside, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The compass in her hand felt warm against her palm, as if it retained some echo of her grandfather's touch. She wound the mechanism the way Victor had taught her, watching the needle swing and settle. It pointed not north, as she had always assumed, but in a different direction entirely. The peculiarity struck her, but grief clouded her thoughts, and she dismissed it as a malfunction. She slipped the compass into her pocket and walked out into the rain, pulling her thin coat tighter against the cold. The studio apartment Elena called home was a far cry from the Hartford family mansion where she had grown up. Located in a questionable neighborhood where sirens were as common as birdsong, the cramped space held everything she owned. Books about art history lined makeshift shelves made from cinder blocks and wooden planks, their spines worn from repeated reading. Her art history degree hung on the wall in a cheap frame, the only decoration she allowed herself. A mattress lay directly on the floor, covered with a threadbare quilt her mother had made years ago. Student loan bills were piled on the desk next to her laptop, constant reminders of the debt that followed her like a shadow. She collapsed onto the mattress, still wearing her damp funeral clothes, too exhausted to change. The weight of the day pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her phone buzzed with a call from Sophie Chen, her best friend, and perhaps her only friend. Sophie was an art restorer who worked independently, one of the few people in Elena's life who understood her passion for preservation and history. The conversation was brief but necessary, Sophie's concern coming through in every word. She insisted that Victor must have left Elena something meaningful, that the old man who had loved his granddaughter so fiercely wouldn't have abandoned her in death. After hanging up, Elena sat in the gathering darkness of her apartment, unable to bring herself to turn on the lights. The antique compass lay on the mattress beside her, and she picked it up again, studying it more carefully. The needle definitely wasn't pointing north. It seemed to pull toward something specific, something in a direction that made no sense for a compass. Victor had given her this compass 16 years ago, and she had treasured it as a sentimental gift. Now she wondered if it had been something more, if her grandfather had embedded some meaning in this simple object that she had missed for all these years. Under her bed, Elena kept a wooden box filled with letters from Victor. Over the years, he had written to her regularly, especially after family gatherings she wasn't invited to, or holidays she spent alone. Each letter was carefully penned in his elegant handwriting, full of encouragement, wisdom, and love. She pulled out one at random and read it by the dim light from the street lamp outside her window. The letter spoke of value and worth, of seeing beauty where others saw nothing. Victor wrote about inheritances and legacies, about the difference between price and value. He reminded her that she had her mother's heart and his eye for beauty, a combination that made her uniquely qualified for something important. The letter ended with a cryptic message about how the most valuable inheritances aren't always the obvious ones. Eleanor had received dozens of such letters over the years, and she had cherished each one. But tonight, reading his words, knowing he was gone, felt different. The letters now felt less like encouragement and more like instructions, as if Victor had been preparing her for something specific. She read through several more, noticing patterns she had missed before. References to hidden value, warnings about trusting appearances, reminders about the importance of careful observation. Each letter seemed to be building toward something, preparing her for a moment that had finally arrived. Sleep came fitfully that night, bringing dreams of the antique shop, of dusty treasures and hidden rooms. In her dreams, Victor walked beside her through endless aisles of forgotten things, pointing at objects she couldn't quite see, telling her something important she couldn't quite hear. His lips moved, but no sound reached her ears. His hand gestured toward shadowy corners where light refused to penetrate. When she woke just before dawn, the compass was still in her hand, its needle still pointing in that strange direction, still certain of its purpose, even when Eleanor had lost all certainty about her own. Mr. Thomas Abernathy's law office occupied the top floor of a building that had stood in the city's financial district since the 1920s. The reception area featured dark mahogany paneling, leather chairs that had molded to the shapes of countless wealthy clients, and walls lined with law books whose gilt-edged pages had likely never been opened. Everything about the space spoke of old money, established power, and the kind of institutional permanence that families like the Hartfords took for granted. Elena arrived early, something she had learned to do over years of disappointing her father. Being punctual was one of the few criticisms he couldn't level against her. The Hartford family arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, sweeping through the reception area like royalty gracing commoners with their presence. Richard didn't acknowledge Elena's existence as he passed. Charles smirked at her before taking a seat as far from her as possible. Diana wrinkled her nose, as if Elena's poverty might be contagious. They had perfected the art of making her feel invisible, while simultaneously ensuring she felt every ounce of their contempt. The receptionist, a young woman who seemed uncomfortable with the obvious family tension, gestured for them to proceed to the conference room. They filed in, with Elena trailing behind, already relegated to her familiar position at the margins. Mr. Abernathy emerged from his private office, a man in his 70s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the bearing of someone who had witnessed too many family dramas to be shocked by human cruelty anymore. He had been Victor's personal attorney for over 40 years, and Elena remembered him from her childhood visits to the shop. He had always treated her with respect, a quality increasingly rare in her life. His expression as he looked at the assembled family was professionally neutral, but Eleanor thought she detected something in his eyes when his gaze lingered on her. Sympathy? Warning? Knowledge of something the others didn't? They settled into the conference room, where an ornate envelope waited on the polished table. Richard took the head of the table by default, Charles at his right hand like a crown prince expecting his coronation. Diana positioned herself to Richard's left, her fingers drumming impatiently on the armrest. Elena sat at the far end, literally and figuratively removed from the center of power. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. Mr. Abernathy opened the envelope with deliberate care, removing several pages of heavy cream-colored paper covered in Victor's familiar handwriting. The reading began with the traditional legal formalities that made Richard shift impatiently in his chair. Victor Hartford, being of sound mind and body, had drafted this document 6 months before his death. The date struck Elena as significant. 6 months ago, Victor had already been ill, though he had hidden it well during their Sunday visits. He had known his time was limited and had made preparations, ensuring everything was documented and protected. Mr. Abernathy's voice was steady as he read, giving equal weight to every word, building toward revelations that would shatter the family's expectations. Richard received Victor's collection of first-edition books valued at approximately $200,000, along with his vintage Mercedes-Benz. A respectable inheritance, but Richard's face showed clear disappointment as the words were read. He had expected more, much more. The books and car were tokens, not the real prize he had been anticipating. Charles inherited Victor's collection of Swiss watches, worth roughly $150,000, and Victor's shares in Hartford Industries. This brought a satisfied smile to Charles's face, the shares representing legitimacy and connection to the family's corporate legacy. Diana received nothing, which was expected but still seemed to sting. She wasn't blood, and Victor had never pretended to accept his son's second wife. Then Mr. Abernathy's eyes found Eleanor, and the atmosphere in the room shifted like the moment before a thunderstorm. Richard and Charles leaned forward, confident that whatever Elena received would be inconsequential, perhaps insulting, certainly something that would remind her of her place. Diana perked up, eager to witness another humiliation, another reminder that Elena didn't belong. But what Victor left to his beloved granddaughter Elena was Hartford Antiques, the shop, the building it occupied, the contents, and everything associated with it. All of it, solely and completely hers, with no strings attached, no conditions, no shares split among family members, just Elena's. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face turned red, then purple, the color rising from his collar like a thermometer measuring rage. Charles sat frozen, his mouth literally hanging open, his confident smirk evaporating into shock. Diana looked between her husband and stepson, as if trying to understand what cosmic joke had just been played on them. Elena herself couldn't process the words. The shop, her grandfather's shop, the place where she had spent every Sunday for 8 years, learning and growing and feeling like she belonged somewhere. The shop she had assumed would be sold and demolished, erased like so many other memories of her mother and grandfather. But the shop was hers now, and the reality of that fact hadn't yet penetrated the fog of her grief and surprise. Mr. Abernathy wasn't finished. There was a codicil, a special addendum to the will written in Victor's own hand. The lawyer's voice took on a different quality as he read it, as if he were channeling Victor himself, letting the old man speak one final time to his family. The codicil explained Victor's reasoning in words that were both gentle and cutting. To Richard, he left words along with the books, reminding his son that knowledge was the real inheritance, not money, and that perhaps if Richard had valued wisdom over wealth, their relationship might have been different. To Charles, he left a challenge along with the watches, suggesting that time would reveal whether his grandson valued moments or minutes, meaning or materialism. But to Elena, Victor left truth and trust. The shop wasn't successful. Victor made that clear in his writing. In fact, it was barely solvent, operating at a loss for the past several years, bleeding money in an age when people wanted new things, not old ones. The building was old and needed expensive repairs that would cost more than Elena probably had. The inventory was difficult to move, full of pieces that appealed only to niche collectors. The location, while once prime, was now in a neighborhood that developers were eyeing for demolition and redevelopment. Any rational person would see it as the worst possible inheritance, a burden rather than a blessing, an anchor that would drag Elena down rather than lift her up. Victor knew his son and eldest grandson would view it as an insult, perhaps even as justice. The books and watches were valuable and portable, easily converted to cash or displayed as status symbols. The shop was a burden, an anchor, a white elephant that would consume resources and energy without offering any realistic return on investment. By leaving it to Elena, Victor was both protecting her from complete disinheritance and ensuring that Richard and Charles would feel they had dodged a bullet. They would walk away, congratulating themselves on their good fortune, never realizing what they had lost. But Victor's final words in the codicil suggested something different, something that made Elena's breath catch. He wrote that he was leaving Elena the shop because she alone had the eyes to see what it truly was. She alone had learned to look beyond surfaces, to find value in unexpected places, to understand that treasure wasn't always obvious. The shop, he wrote, was not what it appeared to be. The real inheritance wasn't the building or the inventory or the business itself. The real inheritance was what lay hidden within, waiting for the right person to discover it. Someone with patience and wisdom and the willingness to look deeper. Someone who had been trained through 8 years of Sunday afternoons to see what others would miss. He ended with a riddle written in Latin, a language he had taught Elena during their sessions together. The words were elegant and cryptic. Quod queris in obscuro latet, oculi tui solum videre possunt. What you seek lies in the darkness. Only your eyes can see it. The phrase hung in the air after Mr. Abernathy finished reading, its meaning obscure to everyone in the room except possibly Elena. She felt the compass in her pocket growing warm, or perhaps that was just her imagination. But something about those words resonated with all the cryptic letters, all the careful lessons, all the preparation that she hadn't recognized as preparation until this moment. Richard erupted as soon as the reading concluded, his anger filling the conference room like a toxic gas that made it hard to breathe. He accused Victor of senility, of being manipulated by Elena, of making a mockery of the family name and legacy. Charles joined in, his voice rising to match his father's, calling the will a joke and demanding it be contested immediately. Diana added her own venom, suggesting that Elena must have done something inappropriate to trick an old man into leaving her anything of value. The accusations flew like weapons, each one designed to wound, to diminish, to put Eleanor back in her place as the rejected daughter who deserved nothing. Eleanor sat silent through the storm of accusations, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes downcast. She had learned years ago that defending herself only prolonged the attacks, that silence was sometimes the only shield she had. Mr. Abernathy, however, had no such restraint. His voice, when he finally spoke, cut through the rage like a knife through silk. He informed the Hartford family that he had personally witnessed Victor signing this will and could personally attest to the old man's perfect mental faculties at the time. He stated that Victor had anticipated challenges and had taken every legal precaution to ensure his wishes would be honored exactly as written. More than that, Mr. Abernathy revealed something that silenced even Richard's fury. Victor had left a substantial sum of money in a trust to be used exclusively for legal fees if his will was contested. The trust was large enough to fund years of litigation, and the trustee, Mr. Abernathy himself, was authorized to spare no expense in defending Victor's final wishes. If the family wanted a legal battle, they would get one, but it would cost them dearly in time, money, and reputation, and they would lose. The calculation was brilliant and merciless. Victor had protected Elena not just with legal documents, but with financial deterrence, ensuring that any attack on his will would be too expensive to pursue. Richard's face went from purple to white as he absorbed this information. He was a businessman, and he understood the calculation instantly. The shop wasn't worth enough to justify the legal costs of fighting for it, and truthfully, he didn't want the shop anyway. He wanted to sell the property for development, and Elena inheriting it meant he couldn't. But fighting for the right to make her life miserable wasn't worth bankrupting himself in legal fees. The math was simple and brutal. Victor had won, even from beyond the grave, and Richard knew it. Charles seemed ready to fight anyway, rage overriding reason. But Richard silenced him with a look that promised future discussions. The Hartford family left the conference room in a cloud of fury and resentment that seemed to lower the temperature by several degrees. Richard paused at the door, long enough to inform Elena that she was no longer welcome at any family events, as if she had been invited before, as if this declaration changed anything. Charles promised that she would regret accepting the shop, that it would bankrupt her and leave her worse off than she already was, that she would come crawling back begging for help that would never come. Diana simply glared, as if Eleanor's good fortune was a personal insult that demanded revenge. Then they were gone, and Eleanor sat alone with Mr. Abernathy in the silent conference room. The lawyer produced a set of keys from his pocket and placed them on the table in front of Elena, with a soft, metallic sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. The shop keys. She recognized them immediately, having seen them on Victor's key ring countless times during their Sunday visits together. Worn brass, with intricate patterns, they looked like antiques themselves, fitting for a shop that dealt in forgotten treasures. Mr. Abernathy explained the practical details in his calm, measured voice. The shop had been closed since Victor's death 3 weeks ago. The utilities were paid through the end of the month, giving Elena a small window before decisions needed to be made. There were some outstanding bills, but nothing overwhelming that would require immediate attention. Victor had left a small amount of cash in a business account to cover immediate expenses, enough for perhaps 2 or 3 months if Elena was careful. The building itself was owned outright, no mortgage, which was perhaps the only truly valuable aspect of the inheritance. But as Mr. Abernathy spoke, his expression suggested he was holding something back, some knowledge he couldn't or wouldn't share in this formal setting. He mentioned that Victor had left Elena a letter, separate from the will, to be given to her privately. The letter was in the shop, in Victor's office, in a specific location only Elena would think to look. Mr. Abernathy also warned her with genuine concern in his eyes. The shop's financial situation was worse than Victor had admitted in the will. There were debts, some to unsavory creditors who had been patient only because they respected Victor and his reputation in the antique community. Those creditors might not be as patient with his granddaughter, a young woman with no business experience and no apparent means to pay them back. The building needed repairs that Elena couldn't afford on her museum salary. The neighborhood was changing, and property developers had been circling Victor's location for years, waiting for him to die so they could make offers to his heirs. In short, Elena had inherited a poisoned chalice that might destroy her financially. She could sell the property and walk away with perhaps enough money to pay off her student loans and start fresh somewhere else, free from the burden of her family's rejection. Or she could try to run the shop and likely lose everything in a matter of months, drowning in debt and responsibility. The rational choice was obvious to anyone looking at the situation objectively. Cut losses, sell quickly, move on. But Mr. Abernathy's final words suggested he knew Eleanor wouldn't make the rational choice, that something in her character or in Victor's training would pull her toward the harder path. He told her that Victor had believed in her completely, had trusted her with something precious that went beyond mere property or business. The old man had been many things over his long life, but he had never been a fool about people or their capabilities. If he left Elena the shop under these difficult circumstances, he had a reason that went deeper than sentiment or spite toward his son. And that reason, Mr. Abernathy suspected, was buried somewhere in the building, waiting to be discovered by someone with the right eyes and the right heart. He couldn't say more, bound by attorney-client privilege and by promises made to a dead man, but his meaningful look said what his words couldn't. Elena left the law office with the keys in her hand and a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Her family had rejected her, had tried to make her feel worthless and defeated, had dismissed her inheritance as a burden they were lucky to avoid. But Victor had given her something they couldn't take away, couldn't diminish, couldn't understand. Not just a shop, but a mystery wrapped in his cryptic final words. Not just an inheritance, but a mission that called to something deep inside her. The rain had stopped, and the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds as Elena stood on the street corner, looking toward the old downtown district where Hartford Antiques had stood for over 60 years. She had a choice to make that would determine the direction of her entire life. Walk away from the burden and the struggle, sell to developers, take the money and run to some other city where the Hartford name meant nothing. Or walk toward the shop and whatever secrets it held, embrace the mystery her grandfather had left her, trust that the man who had loved her when no one else did had a reason for everything he had done. The antique compass in her pocket seemed to grow warm against her leg, as if urging her in a particular direction, as if the mechanism inside understood something she was only beginning to grasp. Elena pulled it out and watched the needle settle, pointing not north, but toward the old downtown district, toward her grandfather's shop, toward her inheritance and her future. The downtown district had seen better days, decades of better days that now existed only in faded photographs and nostalgic memories. Once the heart of the city's commercial life, it had been slowly dying for 2 decades as shopping malls and online retail drew customers away from the old brick-and-mortar establishments. Many buildings stood vacant, their windows boarded up, their signs faded by sun and neglect, their doorways home to pigeons and the occasional homeless person seeking shelter. Those businesses that remained were holdouts, stubborn or poor or both, clinging to a past that wasn't coming back no matter how tightly they held on. The streets that had once bustled with shoppers now hosted mostly delivery trucks and the occasional lost tourist. Hartford Antiques occupied a corner building that had been constructed in the 1920s during the city's golden age of prosperity and optimism. The architecture was beautiful in a faded way. Art Deco details still visible beneath layers of grime and decades of weathering and neglect. The storefront windows, once gleaming showcases for rare treasures that drew collectors from across the region, were now covered with newspapers and brown paper that had yellowed with age. A closed sign hung in the door, along with several official notices that Elena couldn't read from across the street. The building sagged slightly, as if tired from holding up its own history for so many decades, as if grief for its lost owner had become a physical weight. She stood across the street for several minutes, just looking, trying to reconcile this sad, closed building with the warm, welcoming place she had visited every Sunday for 8 years. She had been here hundreds of times, but always while Victor was alive, always when the shop was open and full of life and possibility. Seeing it closed and dark was like seeing a corpse of something that had once been vital and beloved. The building itself seemed to mourn, its windows like closed eyes, its door like a mouth that would never speak again. The neighborhood around the shop had deteriorated significantly even in the years Elena had been visiting, the decay accelerating as if the area was racing towards some inevitable conclusion. A pawn shop operated 2 doors down, its barred windows displaying a sad collection of desperate transactions and broken dreams. A liquor store occupied the other adjacent building, its neon sign flickering even in daylight, advertising cheap oblivion for those who needed it. Across the street, a parking lot full of potholes served a building that looked abandoned, its windows broken, its walls covered in graffiti. A few people moved along the sidewalks, but they walked quickly with heads down, not the leisurely browsing shoppers of earlier decades. These were people with destinations, people who moved through the area rather than to it, people who saw the downtown district as something to traverse rather than experience. Elena understood immediately what Mr. Abernathy had meant about the property's precarious value. The location, once an asset that commanded premium prices, was now a liability that scared away potential buyers. Property developers would want this corner for new construction, not historic preservation or restoration. The building was old enough to have potential historical protection, but probably not significant enough architecturally to guarantee it. It existed in a liminal space, too old to be profitable in its current state, too unremarkable to be protected by preservationists. The highest and best use, as real estate agents would say, was demolition, followed by new construction. Victor's shop was worth more dead than alive. She crossed the street and approached the shop's front door with hands that trembled slightly as she sorted through the keys. Several notices were taped to the glass, each one representing a problem Elena would have to solve. Utility warnings about upcoming shutoffs, tax statements showing amounts due, something from the city building inspector about code violations, a letter from a property management company expressing interest in purchasing the building. Eleanor would have to deal with all of it eventually, but not yet. First, she needed to see what her grandfather had left her, needed to understand the mystery hidden in his cryptic Latin phrase. What you seek lies in the darkness. Only your eyes can see it. The lock was stiff from disuse, and Elena had to jiggle the key before it finally turned with a reluctant grinding sound. The door opened with a creak that echoed in the empty street, and the smell hit her immediately like a physical presence. Old wood, dust, paper, fabric, metal, leather, and beneath it all, the distinctive scent of her grandfather's pipe tobacco that he had smoked despite his doctor's warnings. The smell was so strong, so familiar, so intimately connected to her memories of Sunday afternoons, that for a moment Eleanor forgot Victor was dead. She half expected to hear his voice calling out a greeting from somewhere in the back of the shop, asking what treasures she hoped to discover today, but there was only silence, deep and complete, and somehow accusatory. Elena stepped inside and closed the door behind her, shutting out the street noise and the afternoon light. The shop was dark, the covered windows blocking most of the illumination, leaving only thin cracks of light that created strange shadows. She felt along the wall for the light switch and flipped it hopefully. Nothing happened. Either the electricity had been shut off or the bulbs had burned out, leaving the shop in perpetual twilight. Fortunately, Elena's phone had a flashlight function, and she activated it, sweeping the beam across the interior like a lighthouse searching for ships in fog. The shop was exactly as she remembered it, yet entirely different in ways that made her heart ache. The same crowded aisles that had seemed cozy now felt claustrophobic. The same eclectic mix of furniture, artwork, jewelry, books, and curiosities that had seemed magical now looked like hoarded junk. But without Victor's presence animating the space, without customers browsing and asking questions, without the warm light and gentle classical music Victor always played, the shop felt more like a tomb than a store. Dust covered everything in a fine grey layer, and the air had a stale quality that suggested nothing had moved or breathed here in weeks. The shop wasn't just closed. It was abandoned, forgotten, left behind by time and progress. Elena moved deeper into the shop, her phone's light picking out familiar objects that sparked memories with each recognition. The Victorian writing desk, where she had learned to identify different types of wood grain by touch and smell. The glass cases holding antique jewelry, rings and necklaces that had adorned the fingers and throats of people long dead, each piece carrying stories of love and loss. The section devoted to old books, first editions and rare printings, their leather bindings cracked with age, their pages yellowed but still legible. The corner where Victorian dolls sat with their porcelain faces and glass eyes, eternally young and eternally unsettling. Watching her progress through the shop with unblinking stares, every item held a memory of Victor's patient teaching, his explanation of hallmarks on silver, his demonstration of how to spot reproduction furniture, his stories about the people who had owned these objects, narratives he created or remembered that brought the past to life. He had been a natural teacher, patient and enthusiastic, never condescending, always willing to repeat explanations till Eleanor understood. These Sunday afternoons had been her education in a subject she loved, taught by someone who loved her unconditionally. Now it was all hers, and she had no idea what to do with any of it. The weight of ownership pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She spent the next hour moving through the shop systematically, taking mental inventory not just of the objects, but of the building's condition. What she found was both better and worse than she had feared, a mixed blessing that offered no clear path forward. The inventory was extensive, Victor's 60 years of collecting visible in every corner. Some items were quite valuable, pieces she recognized as potentially worth significant money at the right auctions. Art glass from renowned makers, paintings by minor but legitimate artists, sterling silver serving pieces with documented provenance, a small collection of Civil War-era firearms, antique clocks and watches, rare books, the kind of merchandise that serious collectors would pay premium prices for. But there was also an enormous amount of what could only be called junk, the accumulation of decades of buying without corresponding selling. Mass-produced furniture from the 1970s that nobody wanted, already outdated when it was new. Boxes of costume jewelry, paste and glass masquerading as precious stones. Stacks of old magazines, their pages brittle and their content obsolete. Dishes and glassware that were neither old enough nor rare enough to be interesting to collectors. The detritus of American consumer culture, things people had bought and cherished and eventually discarded, finding their way to Victor's shop where they languished forever. For every valuable piece, there were 10 or 20 items that would be difficult to sell at any price. The building itself was in worse shape than Elena had realized during her Sunday visits, when Victor's presence had somehow disguised the decay. The roof leaked, evidenced by water stains on the ceiling tiles and warped floorboards in several areas that creaked alarmingly underfoot. The heating system was ancient and probably inefficient, a coal converted to gas monster that belonged in a museum itself. The plumbing was original to the building, nearly 100 years old, pipes that groaned and rattled when water ran. The electrical wiring was a patchwork of updates from different eras, none of them recent enough to meet current codes. The covered windows needed reglazing, their putty cracked and falling away. The back door was warped and didn't close properly, a security risk Elena would have to address immediately. Elena tried to calculate what repairs would cost and gave up after a few minutes, overwhelmed by the sheer scope of work needed. It was too much for one person, too much for her limited resources. Even if she sold the valuable inventory, she wouldn't have enough to bring the building up to code and make it habitable as a functioning business. And that was assuming she could find buyers for the good pieces, which would take time and expertise she didn't have. Mr. Abernathy had been right about the poisoned chalice. The rational thing was to sell the property as is and walk away. Some developer would buy it, demolish the building, and put up something modern and profitable. Elena would get enough money to start over somewhere else, doing something else, being someone else. But as she moved through the shop, touching objects her grandfather had touched, walking paths he had walked thousands of times, Elena kept remembering Victor's codicil and its mysterious promise. The shop wasn't what it appeared to be. The real inheritance was hidden, waiting to be discovered. What you seek lies in the darkness. Only your eyes can see it. What was she supposed to see? What had Victor hidden that justified this elaborate setup, the cryptic messages, the careful legal protections? There had to be something more than just a failing business in a declining neighborhood. Victor had been too deliberate, too careful, too knowing to leave her nothing but problems. Elena found herself in the back room, what Victor had called his office, though it was more of a workspace and storage area than a professional office. A scarred wooden desk sat against one wall, its surface covered with papers, ledgers and catalogues that documented decades of transactions. Filing cabinets lined another wall, their drawers stuffed with decades of receipts and records that would take weeks to sort through. Shelves held reference books about antiques, art and history, their spines familiar from the times Elena had consulted them during her visits. A small safe sat in the corner, its door closed but not locked, suggesting Victor had wanted her to be able to access whatever was inside without needing combinations or keys. This was where Victor had done the business side of the operation, such as it was, the paperwork and accounting that kept the shop nominally legal and functional. Elena had spent less time here than in the showroom, preferring the treasures to the tedious record-keeping. But she remembered the space well, remembered sitting in the worn leather chair while Victor worked, asking questions about provenance and authentication. It smelled even more strongly of pipe tobacco here, the scent embedded in the fabric of the chair and the wood of the desk. If she closed her eyes, she could almost pretend her grandfather was still here, just stepped away for a moment, ready to return with some new find. Mr. Abernathy had mentioned a letter, hidden in a place only Elena would think to look, separate from the formal will and its public declarations. She surveyed the office, trying to think like her grandfather, trying to remember lessons he had taught her about hiding things. The safe was too obvious, the first place anyone would look. The filing cabinets too cluttered, too exposed to casual searchers. The desk too conventional, too predictable. Elena moved around the space, running her hands over surfaces, looking for anything unusual, any sign of disturbance. Then she remembered something from her childhood, a game Victor used to play with her that she hadn't thought about in years. When Elena was young, maybe 8 or 9, before her mother died and everything fell apart, she would visit the shop with Margaret on weekends. While her mother examined inventory or discussed business with Victor, Elena would explore the shop like it was a magical kingdom. Victor had created a sort of treasure hunt for her, hiding small gifts throughout the shop for her to find, like a benevolent wizard leaving rewards for a questing hero. A piece of chocolate in a teapot, a colorful ribbon in a jewelry box, a small toy soldier in a desk drawer. The gifts were never expensive, but finding them had been thrilling, a game that taught her to look carefully and think creatively. But his favorite hiding spot, the one he used when he wanted to make the search particularly challenging, had been in this office. There was a loose floorboard under the desk, disguised by the worn rug that covered most of the floor and hid decades of wear. Victor would lift the board and place something inside, then challenge young Elena to find it, giving her cryptic clues that taught her to observe and deduce. She had loved the game, loved the mystery, loved the satisfaction of discovering the hiding place through logic and memory. The game had continued even after Margaret died, one of the few remnants of Elena's childhood that survived the family's dissolution. Victor had been teaching her something all along. Elena knelt beside the desk and rolled back the rug, coughing as dust rose in clouds that made her eyes water. The floorboards looked solid and unremarkable, just old wood worn smooth by decades of feet. But she remembered which one, remembered the location from countless childhood victories. 3 boards in from the left wall, directly under where someone would sit at the desk, positioned so that Victor's feet would rest on it while he worked. She pressed on one end, and sure enough, the board tilted up with a slight creak of protesting nails, revealing a shallow space beneath. The hiding place was still there, still functional, still waiting for her to remember. Beneath the floor was a shallow space, maybe 6 inches deep and a foot wide, carved out of the subfloor or perhaps original to the building's construction. Inside lay a manila envelope, thick with something more substantial than just paper, its edges worn, as if it had been handled many times. Eleanor lifted it out carefully, her hands trembling slightly with anticipation and something like dread. The envelope was sealed with old-fashioned wax, Victor's personal seal pressed into red wax, ensuring privacy and adding ceremony to the moment. It was labeled in Victor's handwriting, his distinctive script, elegant even on manila paper. For Elena, to be opened only when you are ready to see. She sat back on her heels, holding the envelope, overcome by emotion that threatened to spill over into tears. Even in death, Victor was playing their old game, leaving her clues and mysteries to solve. He had left her a treasure hunt, one final puzzle that connected her childhood to this moment, bridging years of separation and loss. And this envelope was the first real clue, the beginning of whatever journey he had planned for her. Elena wanted to open it immediately, wanted to tear through the wax seal and devour whatever secrets lay inside. But something made her hesitate, some instinct or memory of Victor's patient teaching about the importance of being truly ready to receive knowledge. Victor's note said, "When you are ready to see, not when you are curious or desperate or confused." Was she ready? Did she even know what she was supposed to be ready for? She looked around the cluttered office, at the failing shop beyond, at the burden her grandfather had left her. What had Victor seen in her that made him trust her with this mystery? What did he expect her to do with whatever revelation the envelope contained? The weight of expectation pressed down on her, making it hard to think clearly. Part of her wanted to run, to leave the envelope unopened and the mystery unsolved, to sell the property and escape before she became too entangled in Victor's plans. But another part of her, the part that had spent every Sunday for 8 years learning to see value where others saw nothing, knew that running would be a betrayal. Victor had trusted her because he believed she would face whatever truth he had left, no matter how difficult or complicated. The envelope felt heavy in her hands, full of possibilities and obligations that would bind her once she broke the seal. Inside was likely more information, perhaps instructions, definitely answers to some of her questions. But opening it would be a commitment, an acceptance of whatever responsibility Victor was passing to her. Once she read whatever he had written, once she knew the secret he had kept, she couldn't unknow it. She thought about her family's reaction to the will, the rage and mockery and dismissal, Richard's fury, Charles's contempt, Diana's disdain. They had made it clear that accepting this inheritance meant accepting her permanent exile from the Hartford family, severing whatever thin connection might have remained. Not that she had ever really been part of that family after her mother's death, but there had always been a theoretical possibility of reconciliation, a faint hope that time might heal the wounds. Now that door was closed forever, locked and barred by her decision to accept what Victor had left her. There was no going back. She thought about her apartment, her poverty, her dead-end job at the museum where she catalogued artifacts for people who barely knew her name. She thought about the repairs the building needed, repairs she couldn't afford. She thought about the debts Victor had apparently left, creditors who might come calling with demands she couldn't meet. She thought about how easy it would be to walk away right now, before she knew too much, before she became too invested. Sell the property to developers, take whatever money they offered, start over somewhere else where nobody knew she was the disinherited daughter who had disappointed everyone. The fantasy was tempting in its simplicity, but she also thought about Sunday afternoons with her grandfather, about learning to see beneath surfaces and find hidden beauty. She thought about her mother, who would have loved knowing that Eleanor inherited the shop, who would have understood the gift in a way Richard never could. She thought about the compass in her pocket, still pointing towards something in this building, still certain of its direction, even when Eleanor felt lost. She thought about Victor's Latin phrase, about treasures hidden in darkness, about being the only one with eyes to see. He hadn't just left her a building. He had left her a purpose, a mission, something that required her specific knowledge and perspective. Elena carefully placed the envelope in her bag, deciding to take it home where she could open it in private, away from the shop's shadows and memories. She would open it tonight, but not here in the darkening office where Victor's ghost seemed to hover. First, she needed to finish exploring, needed to see everything with clear eyes before she read whatever truth Victor had preserved. She continued her exploration of the shop, moving into areas she had never seen during her Sunday visits. The basement, accessed through a door hidden behind a large armoire that she had to push aside, proved to be a warren of additional storage that extended the length of the building and perhaps beyond. Boxes were stacked floor to ceiling in the basement, each labeled in Victor's meticulous handwriting with dates and brief descriptions. More inventory, more acquisitions that had never made it to the showroom, pieces that Victor had bought and stored and forgotten or deliberately saved for some future purpose. Some boxes dated back decades, their contents long forgotten, their labels faded. Elena opened a few at random, finding Victorian clothing moth-eaten and fragile, a collection of antique cameras that might be valuable to the right collector, stacks of vinyl records from the jazz era, a set of tarnished silver serving pieces. Each box was a time capsule, a snapshot of someone's life and possessions, reduced to objects in cardboard containers waiting in darkness. The basement was in even worse condition than the main shop, suggesting years or decades of neglect and water infiltration. The walls showed signs of water damage, dark stains that suggested repeated flooding or persistent leaks. The floor was uneven and cracked, concrete that had settled and shifted over the decades, creating trip hazards. A strange smell emanated from one corner, suggesting mold or worse, biological decay that would require professional remediation. The ceiling was low, forcing Elena to duck in places where pipes and beams protruded. This space alone would cost thousands to repair properly, and Elena couldn't imagine what value the inventory down here might have. Most of it seemed to be the kind of items that even dedicated antique collectors would pass over. As she moved through the basement, Eleanor's phone light caught something unusual that made her pause and investigate more closely. In the far corner, behind stacks of boxes that clearly hadn't been moved in years, the wall looked different from the surrounding brick. The brick pattern didn't quite match the rest of the basement, the color slightly off, the mortar less weathered. She moved closer, her interest piqued by the anomaly, her grandfather's training alerting her to this inconsistency. Someone had done repair work here, patching what might have been a hole or a door or a window. The repair was old enough to have some age to it, decades probably, but it was definitely not original to the building's construction. Elena pressed against the bricks, testing them, trying to understand what she was seeing. They seemed solid enough, mortared in place properly, not loose or unstable, but something about the section bothered her, triggered some instinct that Victor had cultivated during their time together. Why patch a wall in the basement where nobody would see it? What had been here before the repair? Was this connected to Victor's cryptic message about things hidden in darkness? She made a mental note to investigate further, to perhaps bring tools next time and see what lay behind the bricked-up section. The compass in her pocket seemed to pull toward this wall, its needle swinging in that direction when she held it level. There was a second floor above the shop, accessed by a narrow staircase hidden behind the office that Elena had never noticed during her Sunday visits. The stairs were steep and creaked alarmingly with each step, suggesting structural issues that would need to be addressed. It proved to be a combination of storage and what looked like an apartment Victor had maintained for himself, a private living space separate from the public areas below. A small kitchen, barely functional, with appliances from several decades ago, a bathroom with fixtures from the 1960s, the tile cracked, the plumbing questionable, a bedroom with a single bed and a wardrobe, both pieces antiques themselves, a sitting area with a worn armchair positioned by a window, a reading lamp, and more shelves of books. Victor had apparently spent significant time here, perhaps even lived here full-time in his later years when maintaining a separate residence became too much trouble or too expensive. The apartment was dusty but not abandoned, suggesting he had been using it until shortly before his death. Personal items were scattered throughout, creating an intimate portrait of his final years. His reading glasses on the bedside table, his slippers beside the bed, his favorite coffee mug in the kitchen sink. The apartment felt sacred somehow, a shrine to a man who had lived simply and died alone, whose final years had been spent in this modest space above his failing shop. Elena felt like an intruder moving through Victor's private space, violating the intimacy of rooms he had never invited her into. The bedroom held his clothes, his personal items, the intimate details of his life that she had never seen. The bathroom still contained his shaving kit, his toothbrush, his medications with labels showing prescriptions filled just weeks before his death. The kitchen had his pipe collection displayed on a shelf, each pipe cleaned and maintained, ready for use that would never come. His tin of tobacco sat beside them, still half full, releasing its distinctive scent when Elena lifted the lid. It was too personal, too raw, too much like visiting a museum of recent death rather than ancient history. She sat in the armchair by the window, the same chair where Victor must have sat countless evenings, looking out over the downtown district as the sun set. From here, she could see several blocks in each direction, the mix of abandoned and struggling businesses, the few pedestrians still on the streets as evening approached, the parking lots and vacant lots that marked where buildings had been demolished but nothing new had been built. Her grandfather had lived here, in this modest space above his failing shop, watching his neighborhood die around him year by year. He could have sold out decades ago, taken developer money, and moved somewhere comfortable and safe. He could have closed the shop and retired with dignity, but he hadn't. He had stayed, protecting something, preserving something, waiting for something, waiting for Eleanor. That realization hit her with sudden force that made her catch her breath. Victor hadn't held on to the shop out of stubbornness or nostalgia or inability to let go of the past. He had been waiting for Elena to be ready, for the right moment to pass whatever he was protecting to someone he trusted completely. Everything he had taught her during their Sunday afternoons, every lesson about seeing hidden value, every story about patient observation and careful authentication had been preparation for this moment. He had been training her for years without her realizing it, preparing her to receive whatever responsibility he was passing on, teaching her to see what others would miss. The envelope in her bag seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, as if the weight of its contents was increasing. Whatever was inside, it was important enough that Victor had spent years preparing her to receive it, important enough to build elaborate legal protections around it, important enough to sacrifice his relationship with his son and grandson to protect it. Elena pulled the envelope from her bag and held it, feeling its weight and bulk, seeing Victor's elegant handwriting on the front. For Elena. To be opened only when you are ready to see. Was she ready? She had no idea. But sitting in her grandfather's chair, in his private space, watching the sunset over the neighborhood he had refused to abandon, Elena thought, maybe readiness wasn't something you achieved through preparation. Maybe it was something you claimed through decision. She broke the seal on the envelope with a thumbnail that had been bitten short from nervous habit, the wax cracking and falling away in red fragments. She pulled out the contents carefully, finding several items inside that tumbled onto her lap. A letter, written in Victor's elegant handwriting on cream-colored stationery that felt expensive to the touch. An old photograph, black and white, showing the shop's storefront in what looked like the 1960s when the neighborhood was still thriving. A hand-drawn map of the shop building, detailed and precise, with certain areas marked in red ink that drew the eye. And something else, something that made Elena's heart skip a beat and her hands tremble. A key, not like the brass keys to the shop's doors, but an older key, ornate and unusual, the kind that might open a very old or very special lock. The key was made of iron, heavy and solid, with an elaborate bow decorated with intricate patterns. It was attached to a small leather tag, worn soft with age and handling. On the tag, Victor had written a single word in Latin, his pen strokes careful and deliberate. Veritas. Truth. Eleanor held the key up to the fading light from the window, turning it, studying the elaborate bit that would fit some specific lock somewhere in this building. This was what Victor had hidden, what he had protected, what he had prepared her to find. She set aside the other items and unfolded the letter with hands that shook slightly, Victor's voice seeming to speak through the words as if he were sitting beside her. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have inherited my shop. I know how it must look to you, to everyone who knows the situation. A failing business in a dying neighborhood, more burden than blessing, more problem than solution. Your father and brother certainly saw it that way, which is exactly what I intended them to see. But you, my dear girl, you have always had the ability to see what others miss, to find value where others see only junk. It is time for you to look deeper than you have ever looked before." The letter continued in Victor's measured, thoughtful style, each word chosen carefully, each sentence building toward revelations that would change everything Elena thought she knew. "This building is not what it appears to be," Victor wrote. "The shop you know, the showroom and inventory you have seen during our Sunday visits, is merely the surface, the public face of something much deeper. Beneath lies something I have protected for over 60 years, something I inherited from my own father, and he from his father before him. Our family has been guardians of this secret for 4 generations, passing the responsibility from father to son. But the chain was broken when your father rejected everything I valued, everything your mother loved. So now that duty falls to you, the granddaughter who has the eyes to see and the heart to understand." Victor explained that he chose Elena not because the others wouldn't accept the burden, but because they couldn't see what needed protecting. They lacked the eyes, the heart, the understanding required for this kind of guardianship. They saw value only in price, meaning only in profit, purpose only in accumulation. But Elena had inherited different qualities, both from her mother and from Victor himself. She had been cultivated through their time together, taught to look beyond surfaces, trained to find significance in unexpected places. She was the only one in the Hartford family who could be trusted with this responsibility, the only one who would do what was right rather than what was profitable, the only one who would protect rather than exploit. The key she found with the letter opened a lock that had not been opened in 30 years, Victor wrote. The map showed her where to find what that lock protected, the location marked clearly in red ink. But before she used the key, before she opened what had been sealed, she needed to understand what she was inheriting and accepting. She needed to know the history, the responsibility, the danger, the ethical complexity. She needed to be prepared for what came next, for the decisions she would have to make, for the consequences that would follow those decisions. Victor's words grew more serious, more urgent, as if he were warning her even as he invited her forward. During World War II, as the Nazi regime rose to power in Europe, Victor wrote, countless works of art and precious items were stolen from Jewish families, museums, and private collections. Millions of pieces representing centuries of culture and history were looted systematically. Many pieces were never recovered after the war ended. Some were destroyed deliberately, burned or smashed by people who hated what they represented. Others disappeared into private collections, bought and sold by people who didn't care about their origins. But a small fraction were smuggled out by those who knew what was coming, who understood that preservation mattered more than possession, who risked their lives to save fragments of a culture being deliberately erased. Victor's father had been one of those who helped save what he could during those dark years. As an antique dealer with connections across Europe and America, he worked with a network of people who moved art and artifacts to safety, smuggling them across borders, hiding them in attics and basements, creating false provenance documents to disguise their true origins. Some pieces went to museums under assumed names, others were hidden in private homes, waiting for a time when they could be safely returned to their rightful owners or their descendants. The work was dangerous, illegal in many places, and ethically complex, but it was necessary, a form of resistance against those who wanted to erase an entire people's history and culture from the earth. This shop, this building, had become a hiding place for several such items during and after the war. Not the most famous pieces, those drew too much attention from both authorities and thieves, but significant works nonetheless. Paintings by notable artists whose names meant something in art history, rare manuscripts that documented centuries of scholarship, items of historical and cultural importance that deserved to be preserved and eventually returned to the world. They were supposed to be temporary guests, hidden until the war ended and safe return could be arranged. But the war made recovery impossible for many pieces. Families had been destroyed, communities had been erased. The rightful owners were dead, their descendants scattered or murdered. After the war ended, Victor's father tried to locate the rightful owners of everything he had protected, writing letters, contacting organizations, researching family trees. Some were found and reunited with their property, joyful reunions that made the risks worthwhile. Others had perished in the camps, their entire families erased from existence, leaving no heirs to claim what had been saved. For those pieces, Victor's father made a decision that Victor had upheld for 60 years. They would remain hidden until the world was ready to know of them, until they could be properly restored to their place in history without becoming merely valuable commodities, until someone with the right knowledge and ethics could ensure they ended up where they truly belonged, rather than in the hands of the highest bidder. "I have maintained this hiding place for 60 years, Victor wrote, his handwriting growing less steady, as if emotion affected his pen strokes. "I have kept the secret, paid the costs, carried the burden, protected what was entrusted to our family. And now I entrust it to you, my beloved granddaughter. The key opens a room that is not on any building plan, a space that officially does not exist. The map will show you how to find it. Inside, you will discover what I have protected, what your great-grandfather saved, what our family has guarded for 4 generations. Some pieces should be returned to descendants, if any can be found. Others should go to museums where scholars can study them. A few are so controversial, so politically and historically sensitive, that their existence alone could cause problems that I cannot predict." Victor's letter grew more urgent as it reached its conclusion, his words pressing upon Elena the weight of what she was inheriting. "This is not a treasure, Elena. It is a responsibility, a burden, a trust that carries both moral and legal implications. These items do not belong to us, have never belonged to us. We are merely their custodians, their guardians, their protectors, until they can be returned to the world properly. The shop's inventory, the business itself, those things you can sell if you need to for survival. But what lies hidden must be protected, researched, and eventually restored to the world in the right way, through the right channels, to the right people. This is not about profit. It is about justice, about memory, about preserving what others tried to erase. He acknowledged that this was an enormous burden to place on her young shoulders, that he knew she struggled financially, that the easy path would be to sell everything and start fresh somewhere else without the weight of history pressing down. But Victor believed in her completely, believed she would do what was right rather than what was easy, believed she had the strength and wisdom to carry this responsibility forward. "The map will guide you," he wrote. "The key will open the way. But the decisions about what comes next are yours alone. Trust yourself, trust your education, trust your heart, trust everything I taught you about seeing value where others see nothing. You are ready for this, even if you don't believe it yet. With all my love and confidence, Grandfather Victor." There was a postscript that made Elena pull out the compass immediately, her heart racing with new understanding. "The compass I gave you when you were 12 is more than a sentimental gift. The needle doesn't actually point north, as you may have noticed by now. It points to something else in this building, something magnetic that marks what you seek. Follow it, Elena. Let it guide you to the truth." She wound the compass and watched the needle swing and settle, pointing downward and toward the corner where she'd seen the bricked-up wall in the basement. The compass wasn't broken. It had been modified, calibrated to find something specific, given to her 16 years ago as preparation for this moment. Victor had been planning this for nearly half her lifetime. Elena sat perfectly still in Victor's chair, the letter trembling in her hands as the full weight of the revelation crashed over her in waves. Her grandfather hadn't just left her a shop or even a collection of valuable antiques. He had left her a hidden cache of stolen war art, pieces looted during the Holocaust, protected by her family for 4 generations. He had made her the guardian of items that rightfully belonged to people who were long dead, the keeper of secrets that touched one of history's darkest chapters. These weren't just objects with monetary value. They were evidence, testimony, physical proof of both humanity's worst impulses and its best. The systematic theft and the desperate salvation, the erasure and the preservation. This wasn't an inheritance in any traditional sense. It was a mission that carried profound moral and legal implications she couldn't even begin to calculate. Each piece represented not just art or artifacts, but the possessions of families who had been murdered, communities that had been destroyed, a culture that had been deliberately targeted for extinction. The weight of that truth pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe in the dusty apartment air. She understood now why Victor had been so cryptic, so careful, so elaborate in his preparations. This secret couldn't be revealed carelessly. It required someone who would understand the responsibility, who would prioritize justice over profit, who would see these pieces as sacred trusts rather than valuable commodities. She pulled the compass from her pocket again, the brass warm from her body heat, and wound the mechanism the way her grandfather had taught her 16 years ago. The needle swung and settled with mechanical certainty, pointing not north but downward and toward the basement, toward that strange repaired section of wall she had noticed earlier. The compass had been preparing her for this moment since childhood, a gift that was also a tool, a teaching instrument that would one day guide her to the truth. Everything Victor had done, every lesson and letter and Sunday afternoon, had been building toward this revelation. He had been preparing her to become a guardian, training her to see value beyond price, teaching her to understand that some responsibilities transcend personal interest. Elena looked at the map Victor had drawn, studying its careful details in the fading evening light. It showed the basement layout, but with additional details she hadn't noticed during her brief exploration. The section of wall where the bricks looked different, the place the compass pointed toward, was marked with a red X that dominated the page. And according to the map's annotations in Victor's precise handwriting, behind that wall was a space that shouldn't exist according to any official building plans. A hidden room built into the original structure of the building and concealed for decades. The map showed dimensions, approximately 15 feet by 20 feet, with ceiling height of 8 feet. It showed ventilation shafts, climate control systems, security features. This wasn't a hastily created hiding place. It was an engineered vault, built deliberately and maintained carefully. The implications crashed over her in successive waves that left her breathless and overwhelmed. If Victor was telling the truth, and she had no reason to doubt a man who had never lied to her, then beneath this failing antique shop was a cache of art and artifacts stolen during the Holocaust. Pieces that museums and collectors would pay fortunes to acquire. Pieces that families had mourned for generations, holding memorial services for lost treasures that represented their heritage. Pieces that carried historical and emotional weight beyond mere monetary value. Each one a fragment of a world that had been systematically destroyed. And she was supposed to protect them, research them, find the rightful owners or their descendants, return them properly to the world. All while having barely enough money to feed herself, while facing creditors and property developers and a family that hated her. It seemed impossible, insane, overwhelming beyond her capacity to handle. It was exactly the kind of noble, impractical, ethically complex task that Victor would have undertaken without hesitation. And it was exactly the kind of thing he would have trusted only to Elena, knowing she would see the moral imperative rather than the financial opportunity. She stood and moved to the window, watching the last light fade from the sky as street lamps flickered to life in the downtown district. The shop around her creaked and settled, old wood responding to temperature changes, the building breathing like a living thing that held secrets in its very structure. Somewhere in the basement, behind that repaired wall, was a room full of history and pain and loss, preserved by her great-grandfather, protected by her grandfather, now entrusted to her. She could walk away right now, tonight, and never return. Sell the building without ever opening that hidden room. Let someone else discover the cache during demolition, or let it stay hidden forever, eventually forgotten as the building crumbled. No one would blame her for choosing self-preservation over responsibility, for prioritizing her own survival over abstract ethical obligations to people long dead. But even as the thought formed, Elena knew she couldn't do it. Victor had trusted her, had spent years preparing her, had believed in her when no one else did. Walking away would be a betrayal not just of him, but of everyone who had risked their lives to save those pieces. Everyone who had died hoping their cultural heritage wouldn't be erased. Everyone who deserved to have their stories remembered. The compass in her hand pulled toward the basement with insistent certainty, its modified needle unwavering in its purpose. Elena made her decision in that moment, standing in Victor's apartment as darkness fell. She would go down to the basement tonight. She would find the hidden room. She would see what her grandfather had protected for so long, but not unprepared. She needed proper tools and lighting. She needed to document everything carefully. She needed to be methodical and cautious, treating this discovery with the gravity it deserved. Tomorrow she would return with everything necessary. Tonight she would prepare herself mentally and emotionally for what lay ahead, for the moment when theory became reality and responsibility became concrete. She carefully packed the letter, photograph, map, and key back into the envelope, treating each item with reverence. She took one last look around Victor's apartment, feeling his presence in every worn piece of furniture, every personal item left behind. Then she made her way downstairs through the darkened shop, using her phone's flashlight to navigate the familiar aisles. As she reached the front door and prepared to leave, Elena noticed something that made her freeze in place. Someone was watching from across the street. A man in an expensive coat stood beside a luxury car, looking directly at the shop, at her. When he saw her notice him, he didn't look away or pretend to be doing something else. He simply nodded slightly, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge her presence and perhaps convey some message she couldn't interpret. Then he got into his car and drove away smoothly, leaving Elena staring after him with growing alarm. Someone was already interested in the shop, watching her movements, tracking her activities. Property developers, most likely, circling like vultures who sensed death and opportunity. But maybe something else. Someone who knew or suspected what the building contained. The art world was full of people who specialized in finding lost treasures, and Victor's death would have sent signals to those who paid attention. The clock was ticking faster than Elena had realized. She couldn't take too long to figure out what to do with Victor's secret. Forces were already moving. People who wanted this building demolished or searched, whatever it contained exposed or destroyed or stolen. Eleanor walked back to her apartment through the darkening streets. The envelope clutched tightly to her chest, feeling the weight of 4 generations of Hartford family secrets pressing down on her shoulders. She spent the rest of that night researching on her laptop, diving deep into the history her grandfather had outlined. She learned about the systematic looting of Jewish property during the Holocaust, about the massive art theft that accompanied the Nazi regime's expansion across Europe, about the millions of items that were never recovered after the war ended. She learned about the heroes who had tried to save what they could, museum curators who falsified records, private citizens who hid items in their homes, networks of resistance fighters who smuggled pieces across borders, dealers like her great-grandfather who used their legitimate business connections to move items to safety. The more she read, the more overwhelming the situation became. There were entire organizations dedicated to tracking and recovering stolen art, databases that documented hundreds of thousands of missing pieces. International legal frameworks governed restitution claims. Provenance researchers spent careers tracing the histories of individual works, but there were also massive complications that made simple return impossible in many cases. Some pieces had been sold multiple times to innocent buyers who had legal claims. Some families had died out completely, leaving no clear heirs to receive returned property. Some items were claimed by multiple parties, their true ownership impossible to verify after decades of confusion and loss. The web of legal, ethical, and historical issues was bewildering in its complexity. She also researched the practical aspects of her situation, trying to understand the full scope of what she faced. Building codes and historic preservation laws, property development regulations and zoning restrictions, the financial realities of maintaining an old building in a declining neighborhood. The more she learned, the more precarious her position became crystal clear. The building was valuable as real estate, but expensive to maintain as a functioning structure. She had perhaps 3 to 6 months before financial pressure would force her to either invest heavily in repairs she couldn't afford or sell to developers who would demolish everything. And if she sold, she would have no control over what happened to the hidden room and its contents. The secret would be exposed chaotically. Pieces would be scattered or stolen. The careful work of 4 generations would be undone in an afternoon. As dawn broke over the city, Elena had made several critical decisions that would shape everything that followed. First, she would tell no one about the hidden room until she had seen what was inside and made a full assessment of its contents. Not even Sophie, her closest friend and most trusted confidant. The secret had been protected for too long to be revealed carelessly now, and every additional person who knew increased the risk exponentially. Second, She would document everything with obsessive thoroughness: photographs, descriptions, measurements, provenance research when possible. Whatever happened next, there needed to be a complete record of what had been hidden and why. Evidence that would survive even if the physical pieces didn't. Third, she would seek expert help eventually, but carefully and only when absolutely necessary. She needed people who understood art history, provenance research, and the complex ethical and legal issues involved in handling recovered artifacts. But she also needed people she could trust, not to exploit the situation for personal gain or professional advancement. Finding such people would take time and careful vetting. Fourth, she needed to buy time by making it appear that she was trying to run the shop as a normal business. That meant paying immediate bills, fending off developers and creditors, maintaining the building's facade while she figured out what to do with its secrets. She would need to be strategic, patient, and careful in ways she had never been before. Sophie called just after 8 in the morning, her voice cheerful and concerned. She had been worried about the will reading and wanted to know what had happened, whether Eleanor was okay. Elena told her a carefully edited version of the truth, mentioning the shop inheritance and the building's poor condition, but saying nothing about hidden rooms or stolen art. Sophie immediately offered to come help Elena go through the inventory, using her expertise as an art restorer to identify valuable pieces that could be sold. Elena gratefully accepted, recognizing that she did need help with the legitimate showroom inventory, and Sophie's presence would provide cover for spending time at the shop. She just needed to keep her friend away from the basement and the hidden room until the right moment came. By mid-morning, Elena was back at the shop with supplies purchased with money she couldn't afford to spend: a powerful LED flashlight, crowbars and hammers, work gloves, a dust mask to protect against decades of accumulated particles. She had also brought food and water, anticipating that opening the hidden room might take considerable time. The shop looked even more decrepit in the morning light that filtered through gaps in the covered windows. Several new notices had been attached to the door overnight, each one representing another problem demanding attention. A code violation from the city building inspector threatening fines, a water bill past due with shut-off warning, something from a property management company expressing aggressive interest in purchasing the building immediately for cash. Elena unlocked the door and stepped into the dusty silence that seemed heavier in daylight. The shop felt different now that she knew what lay hidden beneath it, every creak of the floorboards charged with significance. She was standing on top of history in the most literal sense possible. She made her way to the basement, following the path she had discovered the day before, her tools clanking together in the bag slung over her shoulder. The stairs creaked under her weight, protesting her descent, and the smell of mold and age grew stronger as she entered the underground space. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness more effectively than her phone had, illuminating stacks of boxes and abandoned furniture with harsh clarity. She navigated to the far corner where she had noticed the repaired wall, moving boxes aside to clear working space. In better light, and with the map as reference, the patchwork was even more obvious than before. Someone, probably Victor, or possibly his father, had bricked up what must have been a doorway or large opening decades ago. The work was competent but not professional, the kind of careful amateur work someone might do late at night when they couldn't hire contractors who might ask uncomfortable questions. The mortar was strong, but the bricks themselves were slightly different from the surrounding wall, probably salvaged from another source or purchased specifically for this repair. The whole section measured approximately 4 feet wide and 7 feet tall, exactly the dimensions of a doorway sealed for secrecy. Elena pulled out Victor's map and studied it carefully one more time, wanting to be absolutely certain before she started demolishing walls. According to his detailed annotations, the hidden room was approximately 15 feet by 20 feet, located in a space that shouldn't exist according to the building's official architectural plans. The entrance had been behind this wall originally, a doorway that led from the basement into the concealed vault. But the map showed something else that she had missed during her first reading, an important detail that changed her approach. There was a secondary access point through the floor of the office above, disguised as ordinary floorboards that could be lifted by someone who knew the trick. That was interesting and strategic. Victor had left her 2 ways in, probably as a failsafe or security measure. The bricked-up wall was permanent, secure, difficult to breach, without noise and effort that might attract attention. But the floor access was hidden yet functional, easier to use once you knew where it was and how to open it. Elena decided to start with the secondary access, reasoning that it would be quieter, less destructive to the building's structure, and less likely to alert anyone who might be watching the property. She climbed back upstairs to the office and moved furniture around, clearing floor space near the desk. According to the map, the access point was approximately 6 feet from the left wall, in a section of floor that appeared completely ordinary. Victor had drawn a specific pattern on the map, 3 knots in the wood grain forming a triangle, the marker that would identify the right spot. Elena got on her hands and knees and examined the floorboards with intense focus, running her fingers over the wood surface and feeling for irregularities. Most of the boards were worn oak, their finish darkened by age and countless footsteps over decades. But after several minutes of patient searching, she found what she was looking for, a section where 3 prominent knots did indeed form a roughly triangular pattern, exactly as Victor had drawn. The pattern was subtle enough that you wouldn't notice it unless you were specifically looking, but obvious enough once you knew what to seek. She pressed on different parts of the floor around the pattern experimentally, looking for any give or movement, any hint of mechanism. Nothing happened at first, and frustration began to build. Then she remembered something from her childhood, from the old treasure hunt game Victor used to play with her before everything fell apart. He had taught her that sometimes hiding places had combinations, sequences that had to be pressed in the right order to trigger release mechanisms. She studied the 3 knots more carefully, looking for clues about sequence. One was larger than the others, probably first. Of the 2 smaller knots, one was slightly darker, probably second. That left the lighter small knot for third. She pressed them in order with deliberate care. Large, dark, small, light, small. On the third press, she heard a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet office. The sound of a mechanism releasing after years of remaining locked. A section of the floor, approximately 3 feet by 4 feet, lifted slightly at one edge as hidden hinges activated. Elena grabbed the raised edge and pulled with both hands, muscles straining against the weight. The section came up smoothly once it started moving, revealing hidden hinges along one side and a dark opening beneath. A wooden ladder descended into the darkness below, its rungs disappearing into shadow that her flashlight couldn't immediately penetrate. This was it, the entrance to Victor's hidden room, the place where 4 generations of Hartford men had kept their secret. Elena's heart pounded as she shone her flashlight down into the opening, the beam revealing the top of the ladder, but little beyond. The ladder looked sturdy despite its age, maintained even if unused, suggesting Victor had kept it functional even during the decades he hadn't descended. She tested the ladder's stability carefully, placing weight on the first rung and bouncing slightly to check for weakness. It held firm, the wood solid and the construction sound. Eleanor positioned her flashlight to illuminate her path, took a deep breath that tasted of dust and anticipation, and began to descend into the darkness. The ladder was longer than she expected, descending at least 15 feet into the earth beneath the building. As she climbed down rung by rung, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air grew stale, heavy with the scent of age and sealed spaces. Her flashlight beam moved across stone walls as she descended, suggesting that this chamber had been excavated from the bedrock beneath the building, carved out deliberately to create secure storage. When her feet touched solid ground at the bottom of the ladder, Elena swept the flashlight in a circle, trying to get a sense of the space before finding lights. The hidden room was larger than Victor's map had indicated, perhaps 20 feet by 30 feet, with a ceiling height of about 8 feet. The walls were lined with wooden shelving and custom-built cabinets, all of them full of carefully stored items. She found a light switch on the wall near the ladder and flipped it with trembling fingers, half expecting nothing. But fluorescent lights flickered to life overhead, humming with electricity, revealing the full scope of what her grandfather had protected for so many decades. The room was a repository of art and artifacts that took Elena's breath away, each piece carefully wrapped, crated or displayed with obvious care. Paintings leaned against the walls in protective coverings that shielded them from light and humidity. Sculptures sat on pedestals specifically constructed for their dimensions. Glass-front cabinets held smaller items organized with museum-quality attention. Jewelry, manuscripts, rare books, decorative arts, ceremonial objects. Everything was labeled with small tags written in what appeared to be her great-grandfather's handwriting. Dates going back to the 1940s, each tag documenting origin and history. This wasn't just a collection thrown together haphazardly. It was a carefully curated archive, maintained with professional standards, protected with genuine reverence for what these pieces represented. Elena stood frozen in the center of the room for several long moments, completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was seeing. This wasn't just valuable art or interesting artifacts. It was a museum, an archive, a treasure trove of cultural heritage that had been hidden from the world for over 70 years. She approached the nearest painting with trembling hands and carefully lifted the protective covering, revealing a canvas that showed a street scene in what looked like early 20th century Paris, painted in an impressionistic style that spoke of genuine talent. The work was unsigned, but the technique was sophisticated enough to suggest a trained artist, possibly someone significant in art history. The tag attached to the frame was written in faded ink that had somehow survived decades. Recovered from Amsterdam Estate, 1943. Family, Eisenberg. All members confirmed deceased, Camps. No living relatives located as of 1947. Elena's hands trembled as she carefully recovered the painting, her vision blurring with tears. This wasn't just art or artifact or valuable object. These were the possessions of people who had been murdered, families that had been destroyed, futures that had been stolen. Each piece represented not just a lost object, but a lost life. A family that would never be whole again, a future that would never happen. The weight of that truth pressed down on her chest painfully, making it difficult to breathe the stale air of this underground room. She moved to the next item, a small bronze sculpture of a dancer, her clothing and pose suggesting the Art Nouveau period. The tag read, Vienna, 1938. Family, Goldstein. Father survived, emigrated to America. Item returned, 1951. This piece shouldn't be here anymore if it had been returned. Elena's confusion grew until she noticed smaller text at the bottom of the tag. Father died before claim could be finalized. Daughter refuses inheritance. Trauma too severe. Suggested donation to museum awaiting appropriate venue. Eleanor understood then with painful clarity. Some pieces hadn't just been stolen and recovered. They had been rejected by their rightful heirs. The emotional weight too heavy for survivors who wanted nothing that reminded them of what they had lost. These items were orphans twice over. First stolen by the Nazis, then refused by the very people who should have wanted them most. They existed in a terrible liminal space, belonging to no one, wanted by no one who had the right to claim them, waiting in darkness for some resolution that might never come. Elena spent the next several hours systematically documenting everything she could see, driven by Victor's instructions and her own need to understand. She took photographs of each piece with her phone, close-ups of the identifying tags, wide shots of the room's layout and organization. She counted approximately 40 paintings of various sizes and subjects, 20 sculptures ranging from small bronze pieces to life-size marble works, and dozens of smaller items in the cabinets that would require detailed individual examination. At a conservative estimate, if these pieces were authentic and properly attributed, the collection could be worth tens of millions of dollars. Some individual pieces might be worth millions on their own, depending on artist attribution and provenance verification. But money was beside the point entirely, almost offensively irrelevant. These items weren't commodities to be bought and sold for profit. They were evidence of one of history's greatest crimes, testimony preserved through courage and sacrifice. They were physical proof of both humanity's worst impulses and its best, the systematic theft and the desperate salvation, the attempted erasure and the determined preservation. They were fragments of destroyed communities, remnants of erased families, pieces of a cultural heritage that someone had tried very hard to obliterate completely. They deserved to be treated with reverence, studied with care, returned to their rightful places with dignity and respect. They deserved better than to be hidden in a basement room, no matter how well maintained, waiting indefinitely for someone to know what to do with them. As Elena worked her way through the room, she began to notice patterns in the tags and documentation. Her great-grandfather had been methodical in his record-keeping, obsessively thorough. Each tag listed the item's origin, the family it had belonged to, the circumstances of its recovery, and any attempts made to locate rightful owners or descendants. Some families had been found and reunited with their property successfully. Others had vanished entirely, their bloodlines ended in the camps, their names existing only in records of the dead. A few pieces had more complex stories written on additional cards stored with them, tales of legal complications, competing claims, political sensitivities that prevented straightforward return. The sun was setting by the time Elena climbed back up the ladder, her mind reeling from what she had discovered and documented. She had taken hundreds of photographs, filled pages with notes, begun to understand the enormity of the task Victor had left her. This wasn't something she could handle alone or quickly. It would require years of work, teams of experts, substantial funding, legal frameworks she didn't yet understand. It would require her complete commitment, her full attention, perhaps her entire future. And she had no idea how to begin, no clear path forward, no certainty that she could succeed where Victor and his father had struggled. But as she stood in the darkening shop, looking at the open trapdoor that led to 70 years of hidden history, Elena knew she would try. She would find a way to do what was right, no matter how difficult or complicated. She would honor Victor's trust, fulfill the mission he had passed to her, ensure that these pieces found their way home somehow. She closed the trapdoor carefully, moved the desk back into position, and left the shop as night fell completely. Tomorrow she would begin the real work, the patient process of research and authentication and restitution that Victor had prepared her for without her realizing it. Tomorrow she would start becoming the guardian these pieces deserved. The disinherited daughter had inherited more than anyone could have imagined, more than she could have prepared for, more than seemed possible to handle alone. But she had also inherited strength she didn't know she possessed, purpose that gave meaning to her rejection and poverty, and a mission that would define the rest of her life. What her family had dismissed as a burden, what developers wanted to demolish, what Victor had hidden in darkness, Elena would bring into light. The treasures would find their way home, the stories would be told, the dead would be remembered. And the rejected granddaughter would prove that true inheritance had nothing to do with money or status or family approval. It had everything to do with being trusted with something that mattered, with being chosen for who you were rather than who others wanted you to be. Victor had seen in her what no one else had bothered to look for. Now she would prove him right, one piece at a time, one family at a time, one small act of justice at a time. The story was just beginning.